Sorry for that. Anyways, so the story of my talk, reclaiming the stories of the women of Almira, the story of Almira Morse, Elizabeth White, and hopefully, if I have time, to share some of the stories of the women that graced her hall, some of the stories of the students that actively attended Almira. So kind of get started. This is the opening. This picture is when the whole call, Old Main, was opened. The aim of the institution is to provide facilities for the highest and best education for women. It is how Almira College for Women was described in their 1872 to 1873 catalog. Almira College, although not the first, was one of only few institutions to offer a four-year degree for women in the middle of the 19th century. It is either the 13th or the 14th, depending on how you rank it, college to have allowed women a Bachelor of Arts degree ever. From its inception, from 1855 to its closure in 1890, Almira College gave the women of Illinois the same opportunities that many of their brothers, fathers, and husbands had. Greenville University, formerly college, not only stands on this academic excellence of ambition, but also on Almira's goal of elevating women in higher education. So to begin with, how was the college founded, and why did the founders even want a women's college to begin with? So to begin with, there are two families that we primarily talk about when we talk about the founding of Almira: the Moores, Stephen Morse, and Almira Morse, and the Whites, John Brown White and Elizabeth White. These were the two biggest families that had anything to do with the founding of Almira. As to who actually had the idea, whether it was the Whites or the Moores, we don't actually really know who originally proposed the idea. May Tenney, whose presentation will be later on in today, which I would very much encourage you to go to. Some of my lovely friends are presenting on her. Writes in her book that she has John Brown White coming to Greenville in 1854 at the request of his old classmate, Stephen Morse. So John Brown White and Stephen Morse were old classmates. They were actually roommates together while they were at Brown University out on the East Coast. They taught together, they had much of their own lives together, and they were really good friends. So she presents this amazing picturesque scene of John Brown coming to Greenville. And the night that he gets there, they sit by the fire and they have this long discussion about their ideas and their goals and their goals and their hopes for the future about what is going to happen in women in higher education. Almira comes in and boldly proclaims, "There shall be a college for women in Greenville." This is a masterpiece of literary endeavor, as Donald Jordal, who was a history professor here at Greenville, and some of you might remember him who are in this room, wrote, and who's the only one that's actually ever done serious scholarly work on Almira and the founding of it, writes in his book, what is this called? A Biography of John Brown White, that Tenney's book is a masterpiece of exposition, narration, and journalism and poetry, and indeed it is. However, we don't know the historical reality behind who actually proposed Almira College. Even back in 1876, when an article was written trying to describe the history of Almira College in the Almira College Quarterly, or the student publication that allowed the students of Almira to get things published and to have their work sent out to other people, even back then they didn't quite know who had proposed the idea. This idea that John Brown White comes to Greenville at the request of his friend has two possible sources. It might be coming from Will Carson's write-up in the 1909 Historical Souvenir of Greenville, in which he writes, in 1854, the request of his old classmate, Prof. White, visited Greenville. It is also completely possible that Tenney had information that we are not privileged to, or something that was kept that we no longer have in the archives. After all, she knew many of the alumni from Almira and, in fact, helped organize and to establish many of the alumni retreats and alumni gatherings at Greenville for the Almira College women that came back. As Dr. Hartley had mentioned, a lot of the women kept continually coming back to Greenville, even up until the 1940s, to share in this kind of home that we both share. So that kind of covers, either way, we don't really know. But what we do know is that it was built in Greenville because it was Almira's initial gift of $6,000 from the sale of a piece of property that she had gained from an inheritance from her uncle in St. Louis. And as Dr. Hartley would like to stress, it was the very fact that the college started because a woman was the person who gave the initial push of money and the large chunk of money to get the college started to begin with. So that's kind of why it was built in Greenville. But why a women's college in general? Why were these two men in the middle of the 19th century interested in having a women's college? Well, Will Carson, in the same 1909 historical souvenir of Greenville, and this is coming from Donald Jordel's biography of John Brown White, is that they were each the eldest son of a large family with sisters, whose educational advantages in their day were very limited. It must be remembered that while colleges and universities opened their doors to young men, they were closed against young women. Girls must be content with an education which only prepared their brothers for college. This injustice was keenly felt by these young men and felt determined to accomplish something towards elevating the educational standards of women. So, a few more things before moving on to the individual stories that I have prepared. In early 1885, a wooden two-story house was constructed on the grounds that would eventually become the college. In September of the same year, a preparatory school was opened on the second floor, and the White family had moved in onto the first floor and had created an apartment within it. This building still stands, is the Almira College House, is behind the Union right over there. The Bach Museum is now there. I would go recommend you all see the Bach Museum, not totally because my boss runs it, but in addition, in May of 1856, plans were drawn up for a more permanent brick building in which would be occupied either around 1857 or 1858. This is what would become known as Old Main, or as many in this room would know it as Hogue Hall, which unfortunately was torn down in 2008. So that is kind of the background. So this is Almira Morse. This is an older photo, but this is the only photo that we have that's of any decent quality in the archives. So Almira Blanchard Morse was born on December 25th, 1820 in Greenville. She was a remarkable and highly educated woman for the time. Her education included 4 years at Mrs. Wilkinson's School for Young Ladies in St. Louis. After 1 year at Hillsborough Academy, my hometown, she attended Burlington Cemetery in Middleburg, Vermont, which was apparently a noted school for the time. After her education, at the age of 22, she married Stephen Morse, who had a merchant business. So Stephen and his brothers had established a mercantile business in Greenville, and it was extremely profitable, and they were one of the most richest people in Greenville for a very long time. And he was also a graduate of Brown University, the same university that John Brown White had got his undergrad degree from as well. Sorry. My notes printed weird, by the way. So Almira had several roles at the college which bore her name, most prominently including being that of matrion, which was a person who was essentially in charge of the domestic style of life at the college. Someone who went into all the rooms, made sure they were clean, made sure everything was improper, made sure everyone was following the rules, stuff like that. Something along the lines of what we would consider res life today. She also would teach French at the college from time to time when needed and when they were requested it. By the way, language was an additional charge. You were expected to learn language at the college, but you had to pay extra for lessons in language at times. So this is why she didn't teach it full time. She was only taught it when requested. So several other things before we move on. Almira's family had moved from St. Louis up to Greenville, quote, due to the Frenchy atmosphere. What is meant by this, we don't really know, but there are several possibilities. One of the most prominent being that the Frenchy atmosphere could possibly be referring to the slave culture that was in St. Louis, as many French and Spanish settlers had brought slaves along with them. And it is quite possible that the Morris family did not want to be around that and thus moved to a place that slavery was not prominent, i.e. Greenville. In addition, Almira's family seems a bit eccentric. Let's put it like that. So if anyone who's ever visited the Bond County Museum, they will see a very grand hand-carved rose piano. That was Almira's piano, and it was brought from New York to Greenville. The problem of it is that it was built in the days before the railway, meaning there was only two options to transport the piano to Greenville, by land and by water. The problem of it is that it was considered unsuitable to transport a piano that magnitude over land by stagecoach such long distance. Thus, they transported it by water from New York to Greenville. We all live in Greenville. We all know there is no major waterway in Greenville. So they put it on a boat from New York, sailed all down the East Coast by Atlantic Ocean around the tip of Florida, made call at the port of New Orleans, and went all the way up to the Mississippi to St. Louis and unloaded it from a stagecoach onto a stagecoach and unloaded it to Greenville. If that is not eccentric, I don't know what is. A couple other things. Almira excelled at subjects such as music, drawing, and painting. This is one of the reasons why she wanted the piano brought in from New York. These things were considered proper for women to be highly educated in the time, and these are the things that which Almira College very heavily reflected in and taught the subjects as well. Knowing about Almira is great and all, but the reality of it is that she has been written about a few times. A person who has never been written about and who no work has ever really been told is Elizabeth White Wright. Wright White. Yeah. The second wife of John Brown White. Elizabeth Wright was born in 1819 in Leicester, Vermont. She later graduated from the Methodist Seminary in Middleburg, Vermont. She had spent 12 years teaching in the Springfield school system, and it was even reported that she had known Lincoln while she taught in Springfield. Tinney records that Elizabeth and Lincoln would exchange greetings as they walked past one another. Elizabeth would be walking to school on one way, and Lincoln would be walking on the other way. Lincoln was quoted as saying that he could never forget Miss Wright because speaking to her just made him feel better. Honestly, sounds like a politician to me. After 12 years of teaching, she married John Brown White in 1857 and subsequently moved to Greenville and made her acquainted with her new family. As mentioned before, not much has been written about Elizabeth, but there are two notions that stand out in what little has been written about her and the letters that are still preserved in the archives. One is her love for the natural world, particularly flowers and plants, and two, the love that she and John Brown White shared for one another. So when she first moved to Greenville in 1857, Old Main had just been completed. She set herself to the task of making the campus more beautiful. After all, the campus had been ravaged by the cutting and shaping of timbers and the molding and firing of bricks. All that happened right on Hogue Lawn. By the way, if you want to know why Hogue Hall doesn't stand today, that's because the bricks were hand-fired with no temperature control on Hogue Lawn. So, yeah. So she set to work planting a whole bunch of different kinds of plants. She set to work planting elm, maple, evergreen trees, choice shrubs, and numerous flowers. Fruit trees and various other fruit-bearing plants were planted behind Old Main. The front of the campus was adorned with silvery maples, evergreen, and elm trees, many of which still stands there today. In her letters, she described OE to John Brown White, who unfortunately at this point was serving as the infantry chaplain of the 117th Illinois unit. She always described what was in bloom and what was growing in her garden. For instance, in one letter she writes, John, their son, was at work in the garden, which looks very fine. Sweet corn and peas and vine are growing exponentially. The annuals are beginning to bloom, and everything looks so pretty. Or in another letter, she writes, the tulips have never bloomed better. We may have 19 flower beds. So to kind of continue back to this, wanting to build a welcome atmosphere, you have to understand that many of these women were leaving home for the very first time, or leaving their very small communities for the very first time. We think of that even scary today, but it must have been even scarier for them back then, having no idea where they were going, and again, never leaving home. So I think I should have, yep. So this is kind of the objection. It's actually a continuation of the quote I read to begin with, and this is the 1886 catalog. And to kind of go along with this idea of trying to make a comfortable space for these young women, to provide a place for young women, often going from home for the first time, inexperienced, and who required imperatively the influence of a refined and cultivated home, alike from their safety and the proper harmonious development of a true woman. So there was this great sense of trying to make the college as homely and as welcoming as possible. And Elizabeth did that in her own way by planting as many plants and trying to make the campus as beautiful as she could for these women. The other thing that shines very clearly in her letters is the love that she had shared with her husband, John Brown White. In one letter, she writes, she doesn't even care about North and South fighting anymore. She just wants him to be with her. Often they would go on long carriage rides together, going around all of Illinois, trying to have funding for the college. Speaking of funding for the college, I know I don't have much time left, but real quickly, this is the downfall of Almira College. Unfortunately, Almira College was always plagued with financial difficulties. Even as far back as 1860, only 5 years after they had opened, they had already designated that they needed to borrow even more money from a creditor out in Boston. John Brown never liked this, but it was a requirement, and they kept borrowing more and more money over the years and kept getting more and more in debt. History was not on their side either, as the Civil War would eventually break out, and the Civil War and the subsequent recession that happened after the war essentially wrecked the Morrises' merchant business to the point where Stephen Morris and Almira move away from Greenville to Paola, Kansas, because their mercantile business was no longer even able to be sustained. In fact, even John Brown White, whose health had degraded terribly because of the war, a younger version of him might have been able to sustain such financial difficulties, but his body simply could not take it. So the college was eventually sold to someone named James P. Slade, and he operated the college for another 20 to 30 years. And it was somewhat successful, but ultimately the financial difficulties just caught up with the college and they could no longer run it. And it closed down in 1890. Now, if everyone knows their Greenville history, in 1892, Almira College, everything in it, the building, everything, all the equipment is sold to the Free Methodists. And ever since then, it has been Greenville College, now university. So I think I have 5 minutes, so I can squeeze.
I think you have a bit of time. I've got 5 to 10.
Yeah, I have 5 to 10, but we're supposed to stop at 10.
No, I think he said you could go a little over, I think, didn't he? Say about
Oh, here, I'll tell a quick story.
Okay.
So to kind of get what it was like being a student at Almira College, the young women were strictly forbidden from seeing any young men of the town. They were kept very separate from one another, except for one night of the year. The young men of the town were able to come into Old Main for this kind of concert area, and the young men and the young women could actually interact with one another for only one day of the entire semester. And to kind of have that as a background, the one story that is often repeated about students of Almira is from the 1909 commencement speech from F.P. Joy, who was an early financial officer of Greenville, that one night, after everyone had gone to bed and that all lights were supposed to be out and everyone was supposed to be sleeping, John Brown couldn't sleep. Therefore, he went on a small walk around campus, and he saw something odd. He saw a light in the top of Hogue Hall, which would eventually become Hogue Hall, at that time Old Main. And he saw a man with a basket and a rope. And it seemed like the young woman was trying to haul the young man up in the basket. Therefore, he threw the young man out, put himself into the basket, and then the young woman apparently hauled the basket up, only to find the president of the college fuming at her. I don't know how realistic that is. I don't know if this is true or not, but this is the story that constantly is repeated, both in Tenney's work and in many other works that have Almira's College around it. So that's all I got, guys. The end.
Now, we can field some questions.
Yeah.
If anyone has any questions you'd like to ask him. You covered everything.
I guess so.
Brilliant.
Yeah, Manchel?
Yeah, Lucas, can you tell me a little bit about the sources that you were looking through in the
Yeah.
archives?
Totally. So most of it, the main source was Donald Jordal's Life of John Brown White. He is the only person that has ever wrote a major scholarly work on Almira College that has been published. Dr. Sharon Grimes has done quite a bit as well, done a lot of her work, so I've used a lot of her sources as well. A lot of primary sources being the catalogs that Almira College put out and some of the college quarterlies that they put out. Those were student publications that students could write different things, have them published, stuff like that. And then there's a small book of letters that were hand-typed out at one point that were transcribed from original handwritten letters from Elizabeth that I used. But other than that, that's the only stuff that we have from Almira in the archives. So, then obviously Tenney's book as well.
It sounds like the sources are much more readily available for the early years of Almira, not so much for the second iteration of Almira after it got sold.
That pretty much, yeah. Because, so John Brown White and then his wife Elizabeth, as well as Almira, will keep very good records of what they did and their association with the college. When they leave, they kind of just upend our record trail kind of a bit. because we don't have any, it's kind of weird because even the Greenville historical souvenir from 1909, all the people that from Greenville from 1909 are reflecting on how the whites and the Moors impacted them. None of them ever really reflect on how the college, the second owner, whose name was James P. Slade, really how that affected Greenville as a whole. Everything that I have ever read has been John Brown White did this, John Brown White did that, or his wife, Elizabeth, made this impact, or even 20, 30 years after the Whites moved away, it was Elizabeth White had done this for Greenville, Elizabeth White did that for Greenville. I found almost nothing about the second owner other than the fact that he operated the college. One of the creditors that the second owner got was also the person who financed Wash U, but he died, and all his money went to Wash U instead of us. So we're both here. So, but yeah, I don't know if that's a satisfying answer, but yeah.
If I'm not mistaken, and I could be, is John Brown White buried at the
Yeah,
cemetery?
he should be.
Did they
Yeah.
move back, really, or
Elizabeth moved back. So if I understanding correctly what Jordal wrote is that they'll move, so the White family will move up to around southern Illinois and kind of jump between Champaign and Peoria, doing several different things. So John Brown White was a Southern Baptist minister, and he kind of jumps around from parish to parish, taking different appointments as they come along. However, when he dies, his body is brought back to Greenville, and Elizabeth moves back down to Greenville because many of their children continue to teach at the college up until its closure, because many of John Brown White's children, who were only from his first marriage and not from his second marriage, he had no children with Elizabeth, they will continue, since they were raised at Almira, they will continue to live in Greenville and continue to teach at Almira for many years, like I said, until its closure. So Elizabeth comes and moves with her stepchildren and brings John Brown White's body back, and then she'll eventually die as well and be buried with him out. I don't know what the actual cemetery is called, but it's the one like right near Montrose Cemetery. Yeah, the one that's really close to the square. Yeah. So.
And matter of fact, can you tell them a little bit about what we think about Almira's burial spot?
Yeah, there is a burial plot that just has the plaque Almira on it. We assume this is Almira Morse, Almira Blanchard Morse, the founder of Almira College, or at least helped to found it, but we aren't 100% for sure. We know that they moved out to Paola, Kansas, but there seems to be some documentation trail that her sisters bring her back to Greenville, and we assume that that place is Almira Blanchard Morris, but we don't have any confirmation that it actually is. So, yeah. Anything else? That's all I got, guys. Oh, Mancho.
you know, so it was relatively rare for there to be universities for women in the United States at this point in time. Do you have any kind of an idea of how many schools for women?
So Almira was the 13th or 14th in the nation.
Do you think 14? Because I say 13.
Yeah.
So you think 14?
So
So we have the same.
yeah, we're
take.
I'm going off of some other scholarship that I found, but so this is the weird thing. If you sit down and count them out by hand, it's 13, but then there are other places that say 14. So which one it is, I don't know. There could have been one that got lost. But no, it's at this time that Almira is actively operating, there's probably about 20 or so colleges that are actively offering a Bachelor of Arts degree for women in the middle of the 19th century. So we're,
Really early.
yeah, we are one of the few that did that. Which is also interesting because Almira had connections to basically every major higher ed institution in Illinois. She knew the people that started University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, and she even knew the people who started Chicago University, the first one before the Chicago University that is there today. So she was very well connected. And like I said, the same person that was funding Almira College when the second person owned it was the same person that was funding Wash U. He just died and his creditor wanted everything to go to Wash U instead of us. So we had these grand connections from very early on to higher ed education throughout all of Illinois and into St. Louis. So.
Krause might be interested with who also funded Almira College. Was it the Free Methodists?
No, it wasn't the Free Methodists.
We might be interested in that.
Yeah, they had the quote-unquote special consideration of the Baptist church, meaning the Baptists gave money to them but would never actually take on the full financial responsibility of the college because they wanted, so the Baptists wanted a college, but they didn't want to fund it. So they had special patronage of the college because everyone, John Brown White, as I said, was a Baptist minister, and basically everyone that was associated with Almira was Baptist. But they never actually took it over or took it on because they didn't want to pay for it. So, yeah. Anything else? Technically, this is supposed to last like 10 minutes, and it's 10:07, so we have like 3 minutes left if you have anything you want to say.
I'm sort of curious, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot at all because we haven't talked about this at all.
Mhm.
So in the religion aspect of Almira College for women, then it would have had a Baptist lean to it, correct?
I would assume so, but they're not actively teaching theology.
Interesting, isn't it?
So, because goes to the thing, I mentioned it really quickly. The thing that Almira College hits really hard on is the arts. Things like music, drawing, even there are classes that are labeled as biology, but if you look at a lot of the Almira College notes, that we have one notebook from this time. The biology courses are actually just plant courses, what Elizabeth loved, dissecting and understanding how flowers grow or how to maintain gardens and different things along those lines, or even how to draw flowers and different things along that line. These were things that were considered proper for women to be highly educated in. Along with that, also languages as well, like French and German and different things like that. But they weren't actively teaching theology. I mean, this is something even Greenville is not very good at, teaching theology to women very early on. So they forged their own paths, as May Tinney's presentation will show, that even though we didn't do a great job, she made her own path and taught theology anyways. So, it's 10:09. Anyone got 1 minute?
One more question.
Do you know anything about the transition from Almira? It sounds like so there's a couple-year gap. So
From what I've seen, yeah.
is there a smooth transition where some of the students can stay on?
There's
No,
definitely.
I'm
No,
jumping on your-
because I haven't found any clear documentation on that, but I've heard people float that idea around, so I'm not 100% for sure. What it seems to be happening is that in 1890, they open a day school that is business courses for both men and women as a last-ditch effort to try to get more money into it. And I assume that as well, because they were actively accepting people as late as 1890. So I do assume there are some women that are hanging around trying to get their education finished.
Yeah,
And
there are with this. If you look at the catalogs and the information that we have
Mm.
We'll have women that were at Almira College that will continue at Greenville College, yeah.
So yeah,